Thanks for joining me again. We need to talk a little bit about some other Mesopotamian civilizations in addition to the Sumerians, who we've covered a few lectures ago. When we talked about ancient Egypt in the last lecture, I wanted to show you a map that kind of outlines the extent of Egyptian domination for a period of time. You can actually see it trends well on up into what we think of as Mesopotamia at one point, and even into portions of present-day Turkey. Their fortunes, the Egyptians' fortunes on the battlefield, will start to change, however, over time with the rise of the so-called Hittite Empire. Alright, so who were the Hittites? Well, they remain a little bit of an enigma to us today. We have to remember that record-keeping in the ancient world was sometimes incredibly spotty, and all the warfare of subsequent centuries has sometimes wiped out entire libraries full of knowledge. So with the Hittites, we don't know a whole lot about their day-to-day lives. We just know that a very important technological innovation on their part, learning how to create iron weapons and tools, will end up creating for them a brief window of opportunity in which they're going to challenge successfully Egyptian domination in Mesopotamia, and their civilization will briefly expand. Their capital city will be Hattusa, and another thing that makes it a little bit difficult in figuring out who the Hittites were is that everywhere they captured territory, they tended to kind of blend in, culturally speaking, religiously speaking, with those that they ended up conquering. So, for example, when they might take over some Sumerian city-states, they would simply absorb or fold in the worship of many Sumerian deities into their own religious belief. As for the ultimate fate of the Hittites, once this technology, iron weapons and tools, gets out to other civilizations, they will very quickly lose their strategic advantage that they have had, that had helped catapult them to this brief position of prominence in the region. They will more than likely be eventually conquered by the Assyrians, who we'll be talking about later, and also challenged somewhat by the Greek civilization developing in the Mediterranean. We'll turn next to Hebrew civilization, a little bit south of where the Hittites started to make their mark. And as for the origins of the Hebrew peoples, that too is somewhat shrouded in mystery. As best we can tell, they were a Semitic-speaking peoples who probably originated around the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. In other words, they likely had Sumerian roots, or at the very least they cohabitated with the Sumerians over time. Where we start to see them taking a little bit of a different trajectory, though, is when they begin to migrate into a region that is what we think of as the present-day political state of Israel. When they start migrating into this area around the 15th, 14th centuries BC, this is where we start to get some independent confirmation of this particular group as they're settling into farms and creating cities over time. Moving a little farther south as they did, they will also start to bump up against the Egyptian civilization, which is far more powerful than they are militarily. And for some Hebrew peoples, they will be enslaved. Some of their descendants will simply move to the Egyptian areas like Memphis or Thebes to find work or what have you. In other words, early Hebrew civilization at this point will start to kind of be swallowed up by Egyptian civilization, as these people in some cases are sort of forcibly taken away from what they considered at that time to be their homeland, that of Canaan or Palestine. Now, something else worth noting about the Hebrew peoples is for a certain fragment of them, they are following along in the conversion process of moving from being a polytheistic people to a monotheistic people. Monotheism equates to the worship of simply one deity, mono meaning one, of course. And what we're seeing is very early on, actually before the Hebrew peoples even make it to Canaan, you're seeing the legacy of a man by the name of Abraham, who reportedly was called upon by this new one deity to sort of lead his people to abandon their faith in the many different gods and goddesses that they had traditionally worshipped and instead follow only him. Abraham, too, is oftentimes attributed as sort of the father of monotheism because he also encouraged his peoples, the Hebrew peoples, to leave from their homeland in Mesopotamia and to move towards Canaan. Another critical figure in understanding the transition among the Hebrew peoples from polytheism to monotheism is the figure of Moses. Moses is often attributed as being a very influential Hebrew leader who decided to guide his peoples out of Egypt, perhaps around 1300 to 1250 BC. The dates here, again, are very difficult to verify, but around that time period, leading his people out of Egypt to return back to the land of Canaan, which they considered to be their homeland, and that during this very long journey, Moses continued this process of trying to help his people shift from a polytheistic outlook to a monotheistic outlook. Now, in order for us to understand what Hebrew society was like during this time period, a resource that we have, one of the very few resources that we actually have documenting this process, not only the journey of the Hebrew peoples back to Canaan, but what they did when they were there. One of the few resources we have it comes from several books in the Old Testament, specifically the book of Exodus. And it's pretty interesting to see the laws that govern these people's lives, not just religious laws, but laws that also guided their behavior in day-to-day life. And if you'll notice, we can tell quite a bit actually about this very first of the so-called Ten Commandments, thou shalt have no other gods before me. This very first law accorded a position of prominence right out of the gate. Thou shalt have no other gods before me, gives us a pretty clear indication that this process, this journey that Moses is leading his people on, not just a physical journey, but a spiritual journey, abandoning polytheism, embracing monotheism, that this is going to be a long and drawn-out process. And it just stands to reason that the faith of these peoples, the faith of their fathers and grandmothers and generations before them, is not one that they're going to let go of easily and turn instead now to embrace easily the concept of just one deity as opposed to many of them. And of course the name of this new Hebrew deity, Jehovah, or he who causes to be, the creator, Yahweh. It's also interesting to take a look at a few other laws that guided the conduct of their day-to-day lives. The Hebrew peoples, a lot of emphasis on order within the family, honoring thy father and thy mother. A law that deals with children that might strike their father or their mother. In this case, you will be put to death. If you can think back to Hammurabi's code that governed Sumerian society, the penalty for striking your father was to have your hand chopped off. Here in Hebrew society, you lose more than just a limb, if that's the case. We can also see that the Hebrews, like all other human societies, practice slavery. We have a law here that deals with he that stealeth a man and selleth him shall be put to death. The death penalty here being applied not because of the practice of slavery, but instead stealing someone's slave and then trying to sell them. In Hebrew society, there was an expected level of respect for other people's property, and unfortunately, in any system that involves slavery, human beings are deemed as property. We can also see that in Hebrew society, much like in virtually all other human societies, that there was the practice of polygamy, which is usually involves a man taking more than one wife. And in Hebrew society, you can see here they're going to make sure that if that is the case, that the wife should not have to suffer. If a man take him another wife, her food, her clothing, her duty of marriage shall he not diminish. He should treat them all equally. And then this last one should sound somewhat familiar because it was likely modeled very heavily upon Hammurabi's code, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. In this case, the Hebrew people is expecting punishment in every single case. If you commit a crime, you can expect the exact same thing to happen to you, regardless of your social status. When the Hebrew peoples got to their final destination, their homeland that they considered Canaan during this period, they found that the land was not unoccupied. Instead, for the several hundred years in which they were under Egyptian domination, there were countless other tribes that had moved into the region. The Amorites, the Moabites, you even see the Hittites there, the Philistines. And so when they returned to this region and expected to be able to simply take control over it, they're going to meet with resistance. There are tribal peoples here who do not consider this to be the homeland of the Hebrews. They consider it to be their land that they had been settled on, in some cases for hundreds and hundreds of years. So this is going to be a process in which the Hebrew peoples will literally have to battle their way into these regions, going city by city, laying siege. And it's going to be a pretty bloody process full of a great deal of carnage and heartache for both sides. But they will continue to battle on, bolstered by their new monotheistic faith and their belief that their God had chosen them for a special purpose. And in fact, the Hebrew peoples began to call themselves the Israelites during this process. Israelite, that term means soldier of God, believing that their deity was going to see that they were victorious in their efforts here. So the Hebrew peoples will ultimately be successful in battling their way into Canaan. Much of their success will happen under King David. You can see the map here, the extent of his territorial holdings. His son Solomon will also continue to rule this territory, and actually a slightly enlarged amount of territory. Solomon will take over after his father's death and will be remembered for being a very wise and just leader. Also remembered for his construction of the temple in Jerusalem, which will emerge as the holiest site in the faith of Judaism. The monotheistic faith of the Hebrew peoples is what forms the foundation of Judaism. Solomon will spare no expense creating this beautiful building, which will house the Ark of the Covenant and many of the holiest relics of this new faith of Judaism. Solomon was not exceptionally wise when it came to financial matters. However, he will end up having to let certain territories revert back to local control because of some financial decisions that he will make during his rule. This is going to cause some resentment and bitterness amongst those that will follow in Solomon's wake, and we'll actually end up seeing the kingdom of Israel slowly begin to fragment apart and come into some difficulties with some outside invaders who will take advantage of this internal weakness. Those outside invaders will be the Assyrians, who will take over the kingdom of Judah at that point. During the early 7th century, they will overrun the capital city of Samaria, and you can imagine what will happen to the Hebrew peoples. Because they are the losers in battle, they will end up being enslaved by the Assyrians. The map shows you how very large the Assyrian Empire will grow to be over time, and the Assyrians will end up enslaving and actually physically relocating many Hebrew peoples from their homeland, kind of casting them to the four winds, that being their hope to lessen rebellion, to simply pick them up and move them to various areas of the ancient world under their control. So if you've heard of the 12 lost tribes of Israel, that's what it's referring to. And what these Hebrew peoples will do is they will, sometimes in the face of massive discrimination and campaigns for their extermination, they will still manage to hold on to their monotheistic faith. And you'll end up seeing these little pockets of Jewish belief continuing to exist over many hundreds and hundreds of years. So the Assyrians, they are an incredibly warlike civilization. They are polytheistic, not monotheistic, and they will enjoy quite a bit of success on the battlefield due to their creation of huge, professionally trained standing armies. They will employ iron weapons against those they seek to defeat on the battlefield, and they will be ruthless against their enemies. And in fact, this will ultimately come back to haunt them, as several captured tribes, most notably the Babylonians and the Medes, will ultimately rise up against them and rip this once huge empire to shreds eventually.